Priestap. Welcome to the Unfair Fight.
Jon, thank you so much for having me. It's absolutely wonderful to be here.
Awesome. Bill, I know we've known each other for a few years now, mostly since actually you left the Bureau, but you've had a really distinguished career at the FBI. Humbled by that you're willing to join this podcast, but I think it'd be really awesome to let the audience know a little bit about your background, what you did before the Bureau, and kind of what led you to go into the Bureau. Obviously, you're one of our nation's foremost experts on China specifically, and a lot of the kind of counterintelligence efforts that the U.S. has to do against nation state adversaries. But I know there's so much talk about the deep state and us former intelligence guys or current intelligence guys, and I think there's a lot of misconceptions about how this game is really played on the inside. And I think it would be awesome for you to give a little bit of your background, prior.
Sure. No, I'd be happy to. And please know, I said it. I'm delighted to be here and to speak with you. Unfortunately, we didn't get to work together in government, but I've come to know you a bit over the last few years and couldn't be happier for your success, Jon.
Thanks.
The long and short of it, though, no secrets here. I was one of those kids who, after college, wasn't certain what they wanted to do professionally. But I did know one thing, and the one thing I knew is that I love sports. And so I ended up basically trying to get involved in athletics. And I certainly wasn't good enough to keep playing after college. So
what did you play?
I played football, but not particularly well.
Right.
So, but I like to think I tried hard.
Right.
But so again, couldn't play, and I thought, hey, what's the next best thing? Which actually I had some experience in because of the summer camps, summer athletic camps, which I'm sure you're associated or you're familiar with. But it's coaching, and so I was lucky enough when I left college that I had an opportunity for an entry-level coaching position. It happened to be a graduate assistant position, and I went into coaching. It was that easy.
Oh, that's incredible. And where'd you end up coaching and what positions,
Yeah, so it was a variety of places. So I coached, let's see, for probably about 8 years after I graduated. And I coached at a couple different high schools. I coached at 2 Division III colleges. And I also, again, an entry-level coach. And later I was the director of football operations at the University of Michigan. So both some coaching and athletic administration experience.
Oh, that's incredible. So when was this?
Oh, let's see. I graduated from college in 91. I joined the Bureau in 98. And so.
Oh, excellent. And so do you remember, did you guys, that's a serious football program. What future or NFL players were you coaching at the time that you didn't realize?
Yeah, no. And again, it's not a testament at all to my ability. Then again, sometimes you get lucky enough to be the right person at the right place to get into some of these positions. But at Michigan, there were a variety of players from Elvis Gerback, who played in the pros, to Tyrone Wheatley, who played a long time. Tom Brady was on the team.
Oh, he was on the team at the time. That must have. How was he back then? Was he the same maniacal drive for excellence when he was in college? Because I know everyone. We were just talking about this before we started filming. With my kids in kind of the ski racing game. It's a long road. And what'd you observe about him? Because he's clearly a unique individual and one of the greatest achievers in any domain.
Yeah, I'm not sure that I was exposed necessarily to the drive that everybody talks about, and that obviously he possesses. What I most remember about him, for whatever it's worth, was just that he was really a good guy.
Right.
He treated everybody respectfully. He was nice. He was considerate. He worked hard. And to me, he stood out in that regard. Obviously, he's had one of, if not the greatest football career of anybody ever. But frankly, he struck me as a type of young person then that he was going to succeed in whatever it was he decided to do just because of the way he conducted himself.
Right. So a lot of natural leadership traits.
Yes, at least in my estimation, absolutely.
Oh, that's incredible. So here you are, director of football operations at Michigan. How on earth did you end up at the Bureau? That's a big career change. I was a crappy athlete, but I played Division I sports at University of Maryland. And I can't imagine being like in a coaching staff position and then saying, I'm going to go to the FBI and get into law enforcement and intelligence.
Yeah, no, and I have to admit, I didn't come from a family that had worked in law enforcement or intelligence, and so I didn't grow up I didn't grow up in this world at all, right. The world I ended up in.
Same for me, actually.
Yeah, and it isn't amazing, again, the paths our lives take. But I can actually remember sitting it was a Michigan football team meeting room and you can imagine both before the season, during the season, they have a variety of people who come in and talk about different issues to the athletes, what have you. And one of the guest speakers one day was a guy, he remains a friend to this day, so hopefully you won't mind me mentioning him. His name is Greg Stayskull, and he was the head of the FBI's Ann Arbor office at the time. And he came in and spoke to the athletes about a variety of issues he thought they should be familiar with. I was really impressed by him. I was so impressed by him, I took it upon myself to introduce myself to him, and basically we became friends. And one of the things I learned in talking to him was just he loved his job.
Right.
And he talked just so, he just raved about his job and the things he got to do and how much he loved it. And frankly, that rubbed off on me. And so when I was looking to make a change out of athletics, as much as I loved it at that age, I just wasn't, for whatever reason, I'm not, as I look back, I'm not sure what the reason was, but I wasn't ready to commit my life to the rest of my life to athletics. And frankly, right. at that level, at the professional level, you better be all in.
It's a lifestyle for sure.
It's a lifestyle. It absolutely was. And again, after being exposed to it, I wasn't ready to make that commitment. So I began to explore what else might be out there. And the long and short of it is he encouraged me to apply to the FBI. And I ended up doing it. I don't know how I got in, but I then got in, and the rest is history. It's that easy.
Oh, that's incredible. I tell you what, I know for our business, and I think in the government, sports is an interesting thing. I think parents a lot of times get way too into their kids' sports, and I have to pull myself back sometimes with my kids, but they're so focused on winning at a young age, when the reality is sports, I think, is one of the best training grounds for real life after. Now, obviously, if you go into the professional game, that's a whole nother ball game. That's its own profession and really amazing path as well. But I think a lot of times it really teaches you, one, resilience, right? Because the commercial world can be pretty cutthroat and tough. But two, it also teaches you how you can get benefits out of hard work. Not everyone's going to be an elite professional athlete. A lot of that's genetics, but a huge part is those that are willing to kind of accept the grind. And I think that's true in the professional world as well. And so I'd be curious. So you played football, you're a college football coach, heading up operations there. You get into the FBI. Talk to me about training that you went through. Like, what do you remember that you can say? Obviously, we don't want to touch on anything, sensitive in training, but what do you remember about the training? What do you remember about your previous life that you felt made you more prepared to make it through that kind of initial special agent training? What was the hardest part too? I'm actually really curious. I don't know a lot about the Bureau's, kind of training program.
Boy, I feel like we could have this show just on training, but
we're going to get to all the China and national security stuff. But I really want to get to know Bill a little bit, because you don't rise that high in the org for no reason by luck.
No, these are great questions. And if I may, let me back up for a second, because I think I learned this from Greg Stayskull after I got into the Bureau. But basically, after I had applied, and again, he supported, endorsed, whatever the heck it was called then, my application. he told me later he had been contacted and somebody said, yeah, seems like a, good enough applicant, what have you, except he doesn't have any job experience. All he's done is work in athletics.
Right.
and if I recall correctly, Greg was like, you have no idea what athletics entails, especially at the highest level, and certainly at football at the University of Michigan. It's what you live and breathe and work, and there's not enough hours in the day to do all the things you need to do. But you touched on it, the things you have to sacrifice, the things you give up to participate in any regard at athletics in that level. Mm-hmm. But as far as what did I bring to training, I don't know exactly what I brought to training, except that I was willing to work really hard. Mm-hmm. I was used to that from coaching. Like you stay up, you do whatever is necessary to succeed in that environment. I found not everybody found the FBI Academy that difficult. Again, people from law enforcement backgrounds. Mm-hmm. Some people were in other federal government, intelligence community or law enforcement agencies. We had former military people. For a lot of people, some of the issues we were dealing with and being taught about they were familiar with. Almost everything I was confronted was new. So I was a fish out of water. But again, what did I bring? I knew how to work. Right. And I worked really hard. I can remember, I'm still, I guess, a pretty serious guy, but I remember being really serious then. Like I wanted to get through. I was not going to not pass and get through that training. I was going to do whatever it takes. And so I really worked on it to include nights and weekends when we were supposed to be off.
Yeah, I think that's what we'd call grinding. And I think this is one thing I've learned in the commercial world and even, from sports. And I would say, if I had to look back critically at when I played sports, I think I always was going for kind of the quick kill and the quick win, if that made sense, with like kind of overwhelming offense, but I could have used to learn how to grind a lot better. And I realized in the business world and starting a company, and same with intelligence, because the reality is you fail in most operations, actually. Success is, unlike other industries, success intelligence, it's like you need the stars sign, you need a little bit of luck and a lot of planning and resources. But I think I found like that staying power and that mindset of I don't care what's thrown at me, not stopping, not quitting. We're going to be successful and we're going to be smart about how we do it. I think really helps push yourself through. So now you get out of training. Talk us through like a little cliff notes on kind of your career at the Bureau and how you ended up into, kind of the counterintelligence roles. Sure.
I basically, I guess, divide my career into thirds. The first third I spent working what the Bureau basically calls their traditional investigative, the criminal investigative areas. So right. Organized crime, drugs, violent crime, things like that. And then the middle third I spent primarily on counterterrorism, a little bit of intel, but a lot of counterterrorism related matters. And it was really the last third that I fell into the counterintelligence arena. So glad that I did. Right. But long way of saying I really enjoyed all three of those phases of my career. They were very different, but I loved them all in their own way.
If you had to pick one highlight from those three phases that you can talk about, obviously, like was there anything that stood out? Any cases that were, super interesting or high profile?
Yeah, it's interesting. A lot of people I work with remember their career through cases, through situations, operations that we worked. It's funny, when I reflect on my career, I certainly remember a whole lot of things that we did, but I'd say different things stood out for me. Right. So let's talk about the first phase. And again, you got to keep in the back of your mind, I didn't come from this world. So right. Yeah, you go through the FBI Academy and you get exposed to it a bit. But I can remember in Chicago and starting to deal with bad guys, with criminals, people who did at times horrendous things. and you're engaging with these people. You're interviewing them, you're arresting them, you might be interrogating, you're engaging with them in a variety of ways. And the biggest shock to me at the time, not coming from this world, is I don't know what I had in mind, either because of books I read or movies I watched, TV shows, what have you. But I thought, like, in dealing with these people, I was going to be seeing monsters across from me. And again, until I got used to it, I was just shocked at the humanity of the criminals. Some of them had done abhorrent things I certainly don't condone and frankly believe that they needed to be punished for. But when you talk to them like one-on-one, we've talked about our athletic background. There were times I can remember talking football with guys like we were, sitting at a bar with my friend. Now, I wasn't sitting at the bar with these criminals, but the point being, you realize that people are capable of doing some absolutely horrible things, but frankly, for a lot of them, that's not their whole person.
Right.
And so I'm not sure if I'm explaining that well or not, but really just the humanity of people who were engaged in these bad activities came through again and again to me.
Yeah, Bill, that resonates a lot with me because, I tell folks sometimes, and I don't want to over glorify or dramatize, my previous life in the intelligence community, but you tend to watch people, like in my type of role, when they never know they're being watched. And you learn a lot of good and bad about humans when they're totally uncut, if that makes sense. And I still remember, I don't remember specific operations as much, or, of course I remember like some intelligence and collection wins and things like that. I actually remember the people we were targeting the most, and their kids, and what you learn following someone from afar, and kind of how that picture comes together. And I was really shocked with, some were complete shit humans, like you'd expect, because there's a lot of shit humans in the world, but other ones who might have been like really important on the adversary side, I remember walking away with like, damn, like that's a good dad, that's a good mom. They're actually like good humans in one respect, but sometimes they're playing for the wrong team. And I feel like some of the, especially kind of the elite sort of criminals that the Bureau's taking down, they can have like Jekyll and Hyde, like two totally different sides to them, like savage, brutal, needs to be punished. And on the other half, they're kind of a normal human. You can see how they grew into that crazy ass life that they've, picked up on. And that's what I remember. So what you're saying actually resonates massively with me, because it's really easy. And I think this is a kind of a problem in media today, is like, you got to sell a story. So you paint someone as like an A or B, but the reality is humans are much more complex than that. And you experienced it firsthand in the kind of criminal world. So that was phase one. Now phase two.
Yeah, and John, one last thing on that. You're hitting on it, but you see the complexity of human beings, and even people who don't commit those crimes or horrendous acts. We're all imperfect, right? It's just there's degrees. I would say in regards to phase two, which again was primarily counterterrorism, something we hit on before, but in effect the grind, the willingness of not just people in the FBI, but people across the U.S. and government, certainly your old counterparts, what have you, but like to do whatever it takes, meaning whatever hours it takes, whatever energy, whatever resources, in effect, to push back on the terrorism threat that our country was facing. And I think our government basically threw the kitchen sink at that problem after the 9/11 terrorism attacks. And I think we're in a much safer position as a result of that today. But that is one of the things that just really, really jumps out, is when you see people coming together for a common cause, a critically important common cause, and then the great successes that were enjoyed as far as better protecting our country. It was awesome.
It's interesting, Bill, and I hope he doesn't mind me mentioning, this engagement. I hope to have him on the podcast. But I was over in the Middle East, after government, all of us after government career, and I was in a car with Ali Soufan. I don't know if you worked with him, at the Bureau.
I didn't, but I know of him.
You know of him, yeah. And so I think I was asking him, like, what made you different in debriefing or interrogations, whatever term you want to use on this one. And he was like, my knowledge of the Quran, and kind of how, that the kind of some of the terrorist groups tried to, really, shift some of the narratives there. And so, for him, it was a really intellectual approach to, like, we're talking to humans at the end of the day, right? And, their mind got down a certain thought track, and it was really, how do you get them to open up and talk? And in his case, he felt like really, he had such a strong understanding of it. He was able to kind of maybe shoot holes in some of their narratives that they were using as justification to kind of conduct their attacks. But the only reason I bring this up, it's not to, kind of even address the CT world and what we were dealing with, then, but it was more kind of the human element. It's not all what the movies show where you're, beating folks up and stuff like that. Many times it's connecting on a human level and having an honest dialogue, to kind of come out to the closest version of what truth looks like that we can figure out.
Absolutely. And it reminds me of this was after a terrorist attack overseas, and I actually happened to be in that country when the terrorist attack, I was there for work, but when the terrorist attack occurred. And so obviously we didn't have the lead, but we were trying to help the local security and intel services with the issue. But I can remember talking to one of the foreign intel guys, and he had really done a deep dive on the terrorists who had done this dastardly attack. And I remember him saying something to me to the effect of that he really thought they were disenchanted young men who were looking for a place to belong, looking for, in effect, meaning in their lives. And he said something to the effect of, he said, I so wish like our military could have had, some type of engagement with them, whatever, 2-3 years, whatever ago, meaning like those young men would have probably been drawn to serving in his country's military and serving their country. But instead, they didn't find a constructive outlet for their anger, what have you. They ended up becoming terrorists and espousing, a hateful ideology, what have you. But again, these aren't my words. This was a foreign contact of mine who was saying, like, I just wish we could have our government could have gotten to him sooner in a constructive manner, and we probably would have avoided the carnage that we all just lived through.
Yeah, I think, there's a gentleman I used to work with, and he did a PhD dissertation on I'm going to mess this up a little bit. I mean, hopefully you can correct me, but it was essentially monitoring income gap, like at large scales within the country, tied to instability that comes out of it. And it was, this isn't like a statement for socialism or anything like that, but what it was really highlighting is when you get a massive disparity, and then you get a huge group of folks that are disenchanted and have nothing to look forward to. And they're looking for a group to belong. They're looking for, a purpose, a worth, and maybe, income on top of that to go along with it. Whether it's organized crime, kind of gangs in the US, terrorist groups, there is kind of that corollary. And I actually thought his PhD work was actually brilliant, kind of what he laid out, but you can kind of see how that can develop. And I think it's a really important part. Obviously we need to punish these guys and take care of them or take them out or, whatever it takes. But to your point, so much of policing on a global scale, which maybe a lot would argue that's not our job. But at the same time, it's a complex world that's a lot closer to home than it looks like, trying to understand, get a pulse on when a country is starting to head down that path, I think is super important. And maybe obviously we went through a huge, phase here of counterterrorism. I know that's still going on hardcore, all our brothers and sisters in the community that are doing that. But I feel like in the past couple of years, we've entered into a new dynamic in the world we weren't really dealing with in the mid 2000s. I think China was dealing with it, but we were a little bit head in the sand on this front. Big picture. I know you guys at the Bureau were kind of all over this, but so that leads us to kind of, our current global situation with authoritarianism. What are your kind of observation, what's been developing over the past kind of 8-10 years with respect to China, Russia, and some of the kind of puppet regimes that are allied with them that help tee this up? Like, I know it's a loaded question, and it's going to kind of follow into what everyone wants to talk about, which is the balloons. But but this has been developing for a lot longer, and I think it's coming to a head now. So talk us through. You're one of our nation's experts on China, their strategy for economic and development and global dominance.
Well, Jon, it's kind of you to say, and if I could back us up again, kind of the last third of my career, you were asking about things that jump out.
We skipped the last part.
No, that's okay, because this is perfect because it flows completely into the question you just asked. But what I remember most about my years in counterintelligence is trying to convince people in the FBI, across our government, and in private sector about the gravity of the threat. I don't mean I had to convince everybody. There were many people who thought like me, but there were a lot of people who did not. And I just thought that the threat was so large and in so many areas that we, FBI, the government, frankly, citizenry writ large, ought to be doing a whole lot more. And one quick story I'd love to share with you, because it makes me angry to this day. But I can remember sitting in a conference room at another government agency, and I remember a little bit about what we were talking about, but I know I referred to China as an adversary. Mm-hmm. And my counterpart across the table said, "We don't like to think of China as an adversary in this organization. It's a U.S. government agency." I'm not going to name them, but I about fell out of my chair. But I'm not making that up, Jon.
Wow.
There were
wow, that's pretty serious.
Time and time again that, in my opinion, that this country in a whole lot of areas just was not appreciating how bad the threat was. When I talk about a threat from China, of course, I'm talking about the threat from the Chinese Communist Party, not their people. But the Chinese Communist Party is who is in charge. But that to this day, it was doing everything I possibly could to let people appreciate the scale of this. And then in getting to your most recent question, but the idea, like what's happening, to me, there's more and more awareness, not just in government, but in our society, about what people call a kind of great power competition, right. Major geopolitical competition. And of course, the two biggest players are China and Russia. China and the U.S., and of course, Russia's involved as well. But I think of the greatest competition between China and the U.S. Mm-hmm. You mentioned you were a college athlete. Jon, when you competed, were you trying to play for the tie, or were you trying to win?
To the win. And we were a team sport, but really it was an individual sport masquerading as a team sport. And I can tell you, all I cared about was me winning. Yeah. I lost plenty, but that's all I cared about.
But when you play, when you compete, you're trying to win.
Yeah.
So everybody today is saying, okay, there's this geopolitical competition. I hope your listeners will step back and say, you think the Chinese Communist Party is playing to tie, and in effect to share global power? Or do we think they're playing to win? I think you know where I fall on this.
Yeah.
They're playing to win. They're playing to win in all regards. And they're playing us. And we've got to decide, are we going to do what it takes to win? Because if we don't, I think it's going to be a far more unsafe world.
Yeah, I agree, Bill. And I think when you think about us, U.S., China is much larger than the United States from a population standpoint. And one of the things that I'm always concerned about is, the U.S. we've been outsourcing to the point where, and this is not at all to disparage our awesome manufacturing base, but in some ways, I think you can trend into a knowledge management economy, right? But when you look at COVID, I was just trying to buy monitors during COVID. I couldn't get a monitor that was even monitored, if that makes sense. And so when you kind of look at this geopolitical competition, there's a kind of point in time where I'm going to mess up this quote, but when Japan attacked the U.S., I feel like there's a Japanese general or someone senior that said they awoke a sleeping giant because we had a mass ability to produce. I think we're dealing with that on the China side right now. We are kind of the premier military in the world, and our intelligence services are very strong, but they're big and they're making a lot now, and they have a capacity to produce. And yeah, maybe we make something, a plane that is, 20% better, but 80% in mass can be quite effective. And I think, I think that's an area where it's very, very important that we don't underestimate, I think they're an adversary all day long because, like you, they're playing to win. You look at what they're doing in Africa. They're trying to dominate the kind of specifically on the rare earth metal side because they know how important that is. They're trying to catch us, and they're getting damn close on the chip front. So I'm really glad to see some of what we're doing. But talk to us a little bit about. You've done a great presentation on their String of Pearls initiative, their port initiatives, kind of their infrastructure, initiatives. Can you walk kind of myself and the audience through how China is trying to expand their footprint to not only have logistics, but to conduct commerce writ large, and how that ties into their greater national security strategy as you see it? And a little bit on their 5-year plans. I don't think a lot of folks know that how they plan.
Yeah. Well, let me, at the risk of oversimplification, let me try to simplify these ideas, because you said, at least in my mind, a couple of really important things. And one is the idea of, well, you woke us a sleeping giant, meaning the U.S. in that regard. One of my worries, Jon, is I don't know how alert we are in regards still to the scale of the threat. I had mentioned, I think there's much greater awareness of the issue today, but I'm still worried. I'm still worried about, in effect, okay, well, are the resources that are necessary to compete and win in this area, are those truly being dedicated? A few minutes ago, we talked about counterterrorism, and after the 9/11 terrorist attacks, again, our government did everything possible to confront terrorism. Everything. I think we're doing more than we used to be doing when I was in government, but I'm not convinced, Jon, that we're doing everything possible to push back on China. I still think that there's more to be done. We had talked before about, again, in effect, we're in a competition. Hopefully we're in a competition to win. Well, to win this competition, you have to excel in a whole variety of areas, not just one or two. Well, China knows that too. So they're not trying to excel in one or two areas. We'll talk about, well, we've got to protect our technological supremacy in a certain area. Hey, if we do that, we're going to be fine, and we'll continue to be the sole superpower, what have you. From the outside looking in, China is targeting us in every important societal sense that you can think of, in an intelligent sense, which I hope we'll get to later on the balloon, in a military sense, technological sense, a data sense, aerospace, a space sense, a maritime sense, a information space sense, and I could go on and on and on.
Meaning sports, the Olympic push, right? That's another kind of prestige play.
Absolutely, it is. But again, to be a great society, you can't excel in just one or two areas. You have to at least be pretty darn good across the board, and you've got to excel in several of them. But you're exactly right. And it's a long way of saying that, to me, it isn't enough to focus in one or two areas. And again, that's what I saw some great things happening in the counterintelligence arena when I was still involved in government. But they're happening in pockets.
Mm-hmm.
What I'd love to see happen is more coordinated, comprehensive action on behalf of all the necessary government agencies and, of course, all the necessary private sector organizations.
Right.
But I actually think that's what's going to take in order for the U.S. to succeed at the end.
Including with our allies as well. And
no question. Well,
they're just so much bigger than us.
We can't do it without them.
Yeah. So Absolutely. Talk to us a little bit about, just give some perspective on specifically kind of China's ports initiatives and what they're looking to accomplish. I think that's an interesting, if you look at us and kind of coming out of World War II, we went through an epic infrastructure building process. Also coming out of the Great Depression, and that teed up a lot of our ability to kind of produce and do commerce within the United States and externally. What is China doing on this front? I know you gave a great presentation a few years ago in kind of our industry, and I just think it'd be awesome for folks to hear.
No, John, it's actually quite straightforward. They're trying to expand their reach.
Right.
We've already talked about what do they have, like 4 times the amount of people, of course, that this country has, right. But they want to physically be in as many strategic places as they possibly can. And 1, to control certain areas, and 2, God forbid, in the event of hostilities. And so it's all about expanding the reach. And you just touched on with the ports. So it's okay. Yes, let's expand the reach in a commerce sense.
Right.
But also, of course, they're looking to expand their reach in a military sense, in an intelligence sense, in an information sense, and all of that. So right. There's very few areas of the world today that they're not trying to expand their reach in.
Right. I get the sense specifically on ports. And correct me, I know you know this a lot better than I do. I get the sense they look for strategic locations and stressed economies. They come in, they loan lots of money, they help build all the port infrastructure, and it's almost like a loan sharking game where then they kind of have the host country by the balls a little bit. But what they're doing is carving out a strategic area where they can move goods, commerce, which helps their economy. Because at the end of the day, you don't have a great military without a great economy that can support it. And I feel like we're in a big struggle for influence in a lot of these countries. I know it's really easy to sit in the U.S. and say, worry about internal problems. Don't worry about that. But it's that same infrastructure we built coming out of World War II with bases and ports and ability to conduct commerce all over the world that, right now, I think we're struggling for influence in Saudi versus them, for example. And I saw it in the Middle East, and I know it's happening in Asia as well. Anything you can elaborate there on how they go in and get this footprint and get commerce going in countries and why that's a disadvantage for us?
Well, John, you touched on it. What they're doing in not all of these situations, but in many of them, is they're creating dependencies. They're creating the host governments, authorities, what have you, are dependent on, in effect, their investment, the things that they are offering, in effect, to improve a particular area. But because of those, the dependencies they're creating, they then own the turf, own the ground. And if it's not outright control, it's because of their influence that they can influence the people who are supposedly running those areas to get the things done that they want to get done for strategic advantage. And again, it's not all about strategic military advantage. Sure. As you mentioned, it'd be just as much about strategic economic advantage. But it is ultimately about creating advantages for their countries vis-a-vis others, especially ours.
Right. Yeah, and I think kind of a corollary that's maybe closer to my world. So that's kind of on the physical side, the ability to move goods, do trade, and all these big infrastructure components that they can get a hold of that help their economy, of course, in a time of crisis or war, very quickly get repurposed to large industrial footprints that they can operate from and move logistics from, because logistics win wars in a lot of the cases, or almost all of the cases. You can see that in Ukraine with, the struggles Russia's going through. But on the communication side, one of the things I've been glad to see, and this one drove me nuts, in kind of a previous life, but you look at Huawei, for example, right? Huawei, when if you can dominate like chip production and communications and have and own that infrastructure in the world, the amount of influence that you can, wield during peacetime and the amount of preparation of the kind of digital battlefield and comms in wartime is just insane to me. And, when I look at Huawei, they've grown into like a global telecommunications juggernaut when the US invented this stuff. And one of the things I saw, in my opinion, I think they're a huge reason Nortel doesn't exist anymore. Nortel was outsourcing engineering to these guys, specifically on their kind of secure router line. And before you know it, they have, kind of the core routing and switching infrastructure for modern, telecommunications and mobile, kind of phone networks, and then the RF interface. And I think a lot of that technology was stolen, over the years. So, kind of talk to us about a little bit on the kind of how China looks at wielding communications, processing, and cyber to their advantage is, kind of one of their tools in their arsenal for kind of dominance.
Well, and if I may share one story, because I know Huawei is periodically in the news, and can be a variety of competing thoughts. But to me, if you really want to understand Huawei, I think it was about 2019. There was a DOJ indictment on Huawei for activity it had engaged in regards to T-Mobile. But the reason I bring it up, all this is public.
Sure.
But the long and short of it is, T-Mobile had developed a robot. I think it was, well, not I think, I know it was called, they called it Tappy, because basically it was like a human finger, and the robot would touch phones the way human beings touch phones with their fingertips. And it would do all the things we as human beings to basically test it to make sure that the phones were doing all the things that they wanted it to do. And at least at the time, I think it was considered once in, like the T-Mobile was leading in this robot testing area. And a lot of people wanted it. But to include Huawei was one of the companies selling the phones to T-Mobile that T-Mobile would put their software on, what have you. So Huawei really wants the technology. So if I'm remembering the indictment correctly, first thing Huawei does is they basically say, hey, can we buy it? We'll pay you X amount for this. And T-Mobile realizes how valuable that technology is, that robot is, said, nope, we're not going to let you buy it. It gives us an advantage. A lot of things we're doing, it's not for sale. Next thing you know, Huawei engages in an effort where their employees who are engaging with T-Mobile employees regularly are just firing questions to T-Mobile employees kind of all the time, trying to gather bits and pieces of information about the robot. But they're still not getting, despite that effort, they're still not getting everything they need. They then have some type of special program and access to T-Mobile facilities that they're caught basically in the room with the robot when they're not supposed to be, meaning Huawei employees, and to include taking photographs of it. But I guess even that didn't give them everything that they wanted in regards to the understanding the robot. Eventually, though, I think it was a Huawei engineer ends up getting in the room when he's not supposed to be in the room, again with the robot, and he actually breaks off the arm of the robot, puts it in his bag, and walks out.
Are you kidding me?
No, it's again, check out this indictment. It's all out there for the world to see. But like, that's what we're getting at. And if I'm remembering correctly, Huawei at the time had an incentive plan to basically reward their employees anytime they obtained like sensitive information from other companies, what have you. So this wasn't a head in the sand. They're actually encouraging and rewarding employees to do whatever it could to steal from competing companies. To me, that exemplifies the way Huawei operates and what they're willing to do to succeed. And in many ways, I think that can exemplify although again, don't have information that the Chinese
Right.
Communist Party was directing that activity in any way. In my opinion, we're not always playing by the same set of rules.
There's no question. I mean, I think one thing a lot of folks don't know is um, we're not allowed to go steal intellectual property in the government from another country and then hand it to our commercial world to go beat them. It's like not an operation, but the entire rest of the world does it, because historically there's been a lot that you'd want to steal, but that's starting to change, I suspect, slowly. And I think one of the things that, I've read articles from other cybersecurity experts in that, this Huawei threat's overblown and this and that, but I want folks to really understand, like, the way a modern telecommunications network works is you have a big, like, core IP backbone. It's actually, for those that want to nerd out, it's generally called MPLS, multi-protocol label switching. And then that ties together kind of your voice comms, your data comms, you name it. And all this flows over a similar network. Well, if you think about it's 2023, how many companies can operate without comms from one branch to another? I mean, yeah, SD-WAN kind of helps a little bit of that, but all those private circuits run over these same sort of networks. So when you think about what would happen in wartime if you've had frankly, a global adversary, or at least, deep competitor that actually controls and builds that and maintains and does upgrades on that, I mean, they can literally bring communications to their knees. Look at what's going on in Ukraine, for example, and how much they're still reliant for combat operations on their mobile networks, and how much the crazy Russians were actually reliant on their mobile networks for comms. The threat is not overblown, in my opinion. It might not be obvious, and they might not be shipping implanted devices from the factory, but you think about, yeah, well, maybe an upgrade could help, right? And that's another way to introduce it, or, a service contract. And I think, that threat, any Western nation or any nation that wants to be more on our side than the other, I think they're playing massive Russian roulette by letting those infrastructures in. And, I know these guys even, they push hard against Cisco. They try and make them, in other countries look like they don't even, I've seen cases where the other guys are like, look at how beautiful our wiring is and everything. They're always trying to paint the US guys in a bad light. But I think that's just one tiny example. Another example I could give, Bill, that might be interesting, and I got to be careful on this one, but I've seen the case, post-government. Luckily, it was thwarted, but there was a part that flies on, I'm not going to say which domain, but it flies through the air, right? And the Chinese wanted it, and we watched them come in live. This is industrial espionage 101. They break into the network, they enumerate the devices, the groups, all the normal hacker stuff. But what they really wanted, there was a machine that is a CNC machine that's cutting the actual engineered final part. They went right after that to pull the CAD files off it, because that's what's, directing how this part is made. And they wanted this part for their own kind of military vehicle. And they went right into this company. This was a 20-person boutique manufacturer. And you think about that, this is kind of what our corporate world is up against, that they don't quite realize. And a lot of folks think it's only the big names like Lockheed and all that. But the reality is pros target the supply chain. And they target it down to like this tiniest producer of the specialty products. That's usually where a lot of the intellectual property is sitting that they need to get to the next level. So that's something I've observed. Luckily we stopped them before they got there. But I've personally observed this, and if I've seen it in our customer base, we know it's happening at a kind of mass scale.
No, John, no question. And you're hitting on it. And of course, in this country, some of the most innovative things are happening from smaller enterprises. And so we don't think our adversaries understand that. Of course they do. Right. Of course they do. And so they're going to be targeted. And I'm glad you shared that example. And I guess I'd argue it's similar to the Huawei example that I gave in regards to T-Mobile, in which they were after a robot that conducts research and development for T-Mobile, meaning it's not the end product technology. Right. I mean, and there's plenty of times they're after the end product as well. But the whole point is that they want to know from A to Z how all of this works. What does the end product look like? But also, how did the end product get developed? How does the end product get developed? Are there any particular unique business processes in there we ought to be aware of? But in effect, to compete us at our own game, they need to understand all of that and find ways, or try to find ways to do it better than us. It's not about just one of those things. It's about all of those things.
Right. Yeah, no question. So talk to us. I feel like, on a global scale, we kind of have this kind of new front between democracy, free economy, and authoritarianism that is really brewing to really a major fight, a major fight. And you're seeing, folks like Russia and China, even though that's a complicated relationship, it appears to be getting closer, and China's trying to balance how close it appears on the outside because they don't want to disrupt, obviously, their economy and, trade with the West. Like, what are you seeing right now in this kind of global competition between authoritarianism and the way we like to operate?
Yeah. So there's an organization called Freedom House, who I'm not affiliated with in any way. I don't think I even know anybody there. But from what I understand, they're a nonpartisan nonprofit, and for many years now, they've been studying, in effect, freedom around the world. And is freedom increasing in countries? Is it decreasing? If it's increasing, where? Decreasing, where? They identify and study that in a whole variety of countries. And of course, they try to understand the issue globally as well. The reason I bring it up, and it was actually the first time I had read their work, but they came out with a report in early last year, early 2022. I don't think they've come out with the newest version yet. If they have, I'm now looking for it. I haven't seen it in 2023. But basically, what really jumped out for me, and again, if I get some of these figures wrong, I apologize. But if I recall correctly, I think it was they said the 16th consecutive year of decreases in global freedom. It's a long way of saying that in 16 straight years, authoritarianism is gaining ground and democracy is losing ground. Just looking at the past year, it's probably, I'm almost certain, again, although I'm not studying these issues, it's probably going to be 17 whenever that report comes out this year. Right. I would argue that is a really worrying trend, because at least in a lot of my experience, the one thing I've seen in democracies, to include our country, of course, we're far from perfect. There's a lot of things that we can do better. But by and large, with my experience of democratic governments, is by and large, they try to do things the right way. In other words, it's not about lying, cheating, and stealing. On the other hand, there's some of these major countries, and by countries, I'm really referring to their governments, authoritarian governments, who their primary purpose, their primary goal is to stay in power.
Yeah, self-preservation, right?
So absolutely.
That's a Ron 101 right there. There's almost nothing else you need to know. A lot of the people are fantastic in that country, but government.
But the government wants to stay in power. And so what are they willing to do to stay in power? You know what I think they're willing to do? Whatever it takes, period. Yeah. There's frankly a whole lot less desire, let alone actual activities about trying to do things the right way. It's first and foremost, it's about preserving their power. And if possible, for many of them, it's then about expanding their power. So again, the way the world is trending in this regard, I think is particularly worrisome.
Yeah, I think in some ways the Ukraine invasion has started to wake up the West. I mean, I think all of us in the national security profession, not that we miss a lot, don't get me wrong. There's, plenty of arrows we can take, but I think that's one thing we've been seeing coming for a while now. And it was really tough, because the war on terror, in I think many ways, we only have so many resources, to conduct operations, but I think it was in a way allowed that authoritarianism to really increase very rapidly without a lot of ability for us to highlight it and make it of all of government kind of operation. And, I think the good news is, I mean, it's a horrific what's going on over there. I mean, horrible. But in a way, I think it really did help wake up the West and unify it a bit, specifically Europe and the U.S., that it wasn't all roses like it kind of felt like when the economy's good and you don't feel the immediate threat. It's easy to kind of be concerned about other things. But I think that's changing because we're seeing what happens. And I think a lot of times the authoritarian regimes are really looking to expand their power to buy insurance to insure their power. You know, and like Putin, to me, I think he's convinced he wants to go down as, you know, the next Alexander the Great, right? And I think he's been fed a lot of bad information on how capable he'd be, but there's still a massive nuclear power. And, you know, kind of just to switch gears, like, because this is the hot topic of the day, what on earth is going on with these balloons? Your best guess. And, you know, we're shooting stuff down. No one seems to fully know or be willing to talk about what the hell we just shot down. Yeah, some people think they're freaking goddamn aliens. You know, other people are thinking we're smoking weather balloons from our own country. You know, big picture though, it's not all benign. We know it. What do you think is going on with this? Is it line rate intelligence collection? Was it trying to send a message? A little of both. I mean, we all know this has been going on for a while now, but now I think we're starting to tune ourselves to catch more of these. Love to hear your perspective on it.
Yeah, no, and it's actually it's something I've been thinking about quite a bit of late. I'm sure, like many people, and I should preface it with I don't have any inside information, so. What I say are simply my thoughts based on what I'm reading and hearing from the media. But the long and short of it, several minutes ago we talked about this great competition between countries, and between our country especially and China, and so their goal, again, to excel in a whole variety of areas which I've previously mentioned. They need to better understand what we're doing in all these areas if they're going to outcompete us in them. And so, in effect, why do they put what appears as a surveillance balloon over our country? Because of course, they're collecting information, right? John, you know the intel field extremely well. When you're trying to better understand whatever it is you're focused on, you rarely ever, it does happen, but it's rare. You rarely ever have a complete picture, a complete understanding of that thing you're focusing on. So I keep reading about, but they have all these other collection mechanisms. Why they need this one? Yes, they have a whole variety of collection mechanisms, but for some reason they thought that this offered something that, when combined with all the other information they had, provided them a bit clearer picture of what they were focused on. It's about putting these disparate pieces of information together so that you better understand what you're trying to understand in this regard. So again, what was it? You know, everything from signals intelligence to other type of surveillance and intelligence. It could have been combinations of those things, but it was all about trying to understand something better. I've also read a lot, though, about were they trying to send a message and whatever. Let me be really clear. I have no idea if they were trying to send a message, but they have extremely capable intelligence and security services. And so they had to know something this big, this slow moving was likely to get identified. Mm-hmm. But at least according to media reports, the one we shot down was not the first trip over. So maybe because they've had success previously and we hadn't taken any action against it, they just thought, well, we can keep doing it because in effect, there's no ramifications. So part of the idea could have been just, we've got a track record of success. This next one's going to succeed as well. Is it possible they were trying to send us a message? Sure, it's possible.
But they sure seem to be doing a lot of damage control right now. If you look at trying to accuse us, so that tells me, I think a lot of people assumed the message thing because it popped up so close to Secretary Blinken's scheduled trip that, you know, obviously they postponed to go over there. But the way they're responding to me tells me like this went out of control for them. That's, when they flip back to accusing us and this and that. And yeah, I agree with you. I think we tend to build these really expensive, really complex collection platforms, or just look at how we build these huge infrastructures, right? And the thing is, though, I think the way comms are working, and you can kind of see some of this playing out in Ukraine, where old school tactics can work great, but really disparate or discrete kind of platforms can be hyper effective. And if you're just really looking at pragmatist view, a balloon is cheap, it's small on a radar cross section, and you can load a shit ton of sensors on that thing, and you can make a ton of them. And you don't have to worry about launching rockets into space and having this huge constellation to manage. And I suspect you can get much more modern tech and collection equipment on a balloon. I mean, satellite, it takes years to develop those, test them, get them up there. And if you think about what did our phones look like 4 years ago compared to now, think about that like technology gap. To me, I think the balloons, I think the Chinese tend to be quite pragmatic on this stuff. And, we get sometimes, the F-22, for example, is an incredible platform. It's also like a Formula One car that takes an army of people to get off the ground. If you think about a great power war competition, you look like World War II, it's like, how fast can we produce, ships? I think we were producing one like merchant ship a day at one point there. I mean, I think that's my take on it. But like you, I have zero inside information. So it's speculation at its best.
But again, you know Intel, and you also know there is no perfect collection medium.
Never.
It's the totality of collection mediums together that's going to give you the clearest picture. Yeah. And so again, to me, this offered something of value different or better than all of the other things they had going on. And it's combining what this offered with all their other mechanisms that all of a sudden they get the picture that they're trying to get.
Yeah, I think for like an internet world, it's kind of a crowdsourcing concept to intelligence. I think can be hyper effective, where you just have lots of platforms. Because you're right, I can remember some pretty perfect intelligence pictures, like the best you could possibly ever get on collection, and even then we had tons of questions and gaps. You know what I mean? So I totally agree with you on this. So kind of switching gears to the last topic. You start off in sports. You had a really distinguished career in the Bureau. What are you up to these days?
Yeah, so, I so appreciate you asking, but I co-founded a small advisory firm with a guy I used to work with. His name's Holden Triplett, a super talented, wonderful guy. And the one thing I've been really happy about, so I get asked all the time, John, do you miss the Bureau? Do you miss government? And I can honestly say I don't.
Really?
I don't. I miss many of the people I worked with wonderful people doing hopefully some really positive things. But where I feel like I've been so fortunate moving up into the private sector, actually much like your line of work, I'm still getting to work on a lot of the issues I care so much about. So again, I'm now in the private sector, not in the government, but in many ways my mission remains the same, in which I'm trying to protect organizations, primarily the U.S., but not just the U.S., but organizations from a whole variety of threats, from in effect, people and organizations who wish them harm,
like insider
and all those type of things. And so the long and short of it is I've taken my mission from government and been able to translate that to the private sector, and I'm having a lot of fun doing it.
Oh, that's incredible. So how would let's say a company's interested, right? How do they engage with your company? What's the name of it?
The name is Trenchcoat Advisors. So
Ooh, I like that one.
Please don't laugh. What we found is people seem to either really like it or they hate it. It engenders strong feelings.
Well, now you're winning. I mean, number one job of marketing is create emotional responses. Hopefully it's the one you want.
Well, I was going to say that the one thing I like about people tend to remember it, if
Right.
nothing else. And if I could give you a quick story on why we chose it, I'm sure like your company, John, you spend an inordinate amount of time trying to come up with names,
Yeah.
what have you, and that, nothing sounds exactly right, but to us, this came as close as possible. Obviously, for the FBI and the spy world, they're often known as spies wearing a trench coat and a fedora. So we give it a wink and a nod to that. But even more importantly, when we were doing our research, we found out that trench coats were first mass produced for soldiers in England during World War II. The government was looking for a garment that they could give their soldiers to better protect their soldiers from blood and guts and mud and insects and all those kind of things. Mm-hmm. And the long and short of it, they started mass producing them, and then the public liked the way they looked, and they're so popular that people still wear them today. But we love that idea around, in effect, protect organizations from bad things, bad elements, what have you. And we help companies do that in a whole variety of ways. You can find us on our website. You can email us. You can call us. But we do everything from risk assessments to high speed, quite complex executive briefings. Mm-hmm. We don't conduct investigations, but we help guide investigations when they have problems internally. I could go on and on and on with our services, but we basically, if it comes to an organization that's trying to better identify and mitigate the most pressing security risks they're confronting, we can probably help.
Bill, that's fantastic. First off, I want to thank you for your service to our country. Very distinguished career, especially in the last third of your career during some, tough times, I would say, politically, big picture. And we on purpose didn't talk about that. But first off, thank you, for your service, and thank you for coming on the Unfair Fight.
No, John, thank you so much. It was my pleasure.
Awesome. Thanks.